Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and it's truly a special treat for me to be hosting Tom Ricks, who's here to talk about his new novel, Everyone Knows But You, A Tale of Murder on the Maine coast. And it is a special treat because I've done this several times now over the past dozen years or so when Tom regularly comes out with books. But he and I covered the Pentagon together in a previous life when we were both at the Washington Post. And I was then and remain an admirer of Tom's researching and writing talents, although I must confess, I hadn't expected him to produce a murder mystery. This is his first. He's had such an illustrious career in journalism covering military operations in, I don't know, you name it, Somalia, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And nearly all his previous books have been works of nonfiction on such military topics as the U.S. war in Iraq, on commanding generals, on the U.S. Marine Corps. And even when, in his last book, he wrote about the civil rights movement, he applied a military lens to assess the movement's history. And then once before, a little more than 20 years ago, when Tom first tried his hand at fiction, the novel that he wrote, A Soldier's Duty, had a military context. But here he is now, coming out with a crime story. And judging by this debut venture into mystery, he does indeed, I think, have a knack for this kind of writing as well. His new books, it's a heck of a yarn with a very, very suspenseful plot, intriguing characters, and a strong sense of place. I'm 2/3 of the way through. I can't figure out who did it yet, although Tom tells me that there are clues there, but I guess they're well disguised. The story features an FBI agent who, while grieving over his own family tragedy, sets out to solve a killing in Maine. Tom's called the book a love letter to Maine disguised as a murder mystery. When he was back in his youth, he worked in the Maine woods, and he even has some experience now actually trapping lobsters off the Maine coast. And years ago, he left Washington to live on an island in Maine and divides his time now between there and Texas. His book vividly captures the insular world of a fishing village on the Maine coast, and also, like his earlier works, reflects his eye for detail, his interest in history, and an appreciation for nuance and complexity. It's just out today. This is a release date, so I'm very eager to hear him talk about it. Please join me in welcoming Tom Ricks.
Thank you. That was a lovely introduction. This has been an interesting day for me. This is actually the first day the books came out. It's only been on sale now for about 8 hours. And it's in the top 100 on Amazon. So it's been a pleasant surprise. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Can you hear me back there in the cheap seats, Peg? Okay. And I do know most of the people here, I think. They're all relatives, former colleagues, and so on.
Is your mic on?
Is the mic high up enough?
It's better. It's closer.
That better?
Yes.
Okay. So, off to the races. I've never done this before in the dozen or so readings I've done here. Begin by reading from the book. But this is a book of fiction, and none of you have read it, except for my daughter Molly.
I got 2 copies when I came in early.
Good job.
I've already read one copy, one chapter.
Good job. So I thought I would begin by reading one scene. Actually, my favorite scene of the book. It's a scene setter. Uh, he's our FBI agent is walking in to basically a diner that's on the waterfront in this little fishing town. It's called the Fisherman's Pal. At the time I wrote this scene, my wife and I were probably eating in the Fisherman's Pal, which is really named Harbor Cafe, twice a week. I didn't know when I was writing this scene that they were in real trouble financially. And since I wrote this, it's closed. So it turns out this is almost an elegy for this lovely little spot where the whole town came together every morning at 4:30 in the morning before the fishing boats went out. Cars and trucks were clustered outside a restaurant called the Fisherman's Pal. Inside, the restaurant was bustling, the air thick and humid with the rich, steamy aromas of brewing coffee, toasting bread, and sizzling bacon. Ryan, this is our FBI agent protagonist, Ryan surveyed the place partly out of lawman's habit. Most of the tables were full, even at 4:30 in the morning. These were working people in the northeasternmost part of the nation. Their labors began at dawn and lasted until about mid-afternoon. That was partly because the mornings were less windy out on the ocean, making it easier to fish then. But it was also because in the depths of winter, this far east and north, the sky grew light around 6 o'clock in the morning and dark by 4 in the afternoon. That solar cycle also set the work schedule for the boatyard, the biggest single employer in town. Even though the restaurant was crowded, 5 vacant stools stood at the end of the counter. Ryan slid onto the red plastic of the leftmost. A red-haired waitress glared at him, but otherwise did not acknowledge his presence. He waited, read the menu, waited more. Bits of conversation floated across the room, particularly from the corners, which acted as amplifiers. True fact, do not eat lunch in the corner of the Harbor Cafe. Everybody in town will know your business. Hey, one voice shouted, your new impeller came in. Thanks, I'll stop by, the response. Ain't cheap, never is. It had the feeling of a town conversing with itself, of one big exchange among lifelong familiars. A man came in and stopped by a table. Sorry to hear about your mom. She doing better? Ryan heard another quick exchange. Bought that new floating rope. I think it parts too easily. The person next to him said, goddamn federal regulations, fuck the whales. This is the floating rope controversy, which is a major issue in Maine. Another guy walked in the front door and saw someone eating breakfast in one of the booths. The one just arriving shouted across the room, hey, numbnuts, your truck is blocking mine on the wharf. Sorry, Bill, I thought you was still down in Portland. He held a forkful of scrambled eggs in front of his mouth. You know I had to be back for the selectmen's meeting. Was that last night? I forgot. How'd it go? The fork covered. Well, he sighed, we've got to increase some property taxes to pay for the snow plowing and the road salt this coming winter. And right now, I'm feeling like we're going to raise yours. Fuck you, too. Laughs on both sides. Hearty, good-natured Maine banter. The egg completed its journey. The Maine humor is something I really enjoyed writing about. One of the things that happens to this poor FBI agent is almost the first question he gets from everybody is, FBI Bangor? You got assigned to Bangor? You must have fucked up pretty bad, fella. And it's true. That's how Mainers will talk to you. Very straightforward. They say what they're thinking. And they're also kind of a pre-industrial culture, respects physical labor much more than the type of labor most all of us do, intellectual labor, reading and writing or whatever. A neighbor of mine in Maine was describing one of the summer residents near him and said, the guy's an investment banker. I don't think he's good for much else. That contempt for sort of that world can be very refreshing. It's also very, very different. The fishing world is a violent world. There's a high number of casualties. People drown, people get hooks, and people do a lot of drugs sometimes out there. A friend of mine who's a tugboat captain said that heroin follows the fishing trade. Wherever the fishermen are, you can find heroin. And as well, OxyContin these days. A young woman I know who was the stern man, it's called, the second person on a lobster boat, wrote an eloquent piece about how during her week of work, she said, you begin Monday morning by toking up on marijuana as the boat headed out. Then she said we'd usually drink beer the whole way back in at the end of the day, sort of an hour coming back in. And then she said for parties, you do oxy and cocaine, and then for downtime, heroin. And that was her life. She said the best thing that ever happened to me was getting busted and sent to prison because she's alive. So I have moved from nonfiction to fiction. It's different. As I said on the television this morning, you can make this stuff up. And I find it's a lot more fun. It's a lot easier. You don't have to worry about that mosaic of facts being damaged during the editing process. My wife says I'm a lot easier to live with and doesn't want me to go back to nonfiction. In some ways, I think all fiction, though, also carries a moral responsibility that surprised me. In a nonfiction book, you can say, General Washington picked up a rock. I don't know why he did it, but people saw him pick up a rock. If somebody picks up a rock in a novel, in a piece of fiction, there has to be a reason. You're responsible for the moral universe. Otherwise, you're wasting the reader's time. Why are you talking about this rock being picked up? It has to somehow make coherent sense in the context of the world you're writing about. In this book, the first mystery to me was an introduction to the terrain, how different it is, and how, in order to solve the murder, the FBI agent has to figure out the culture and realize that it's a very different place than he thought it was. At the end, he's sort of thinking about this, and he says to himself, we talk about the lethal vices, but we don't talk often about the lethal virtues. It's a good brain exercise. It really does seem to use a different part of the brain, writing fiction. And it makes for the quotidian life that you lead interesting. Yesterday, I was walking on Wisconsin Avenue, and a woman walked by me wearing these giant, sort of, I think of them as Arabian Nights pants and a tube top. And I thought she looks like a walking vase. And I thought, in a novel I'm working on right now, that's what the character needs to be wearing for that scene. This sort of odd, unexpected outfit. Odd and unexpected is also what Maine is. And it's very much, as Brad said, a book about this unusual place, the state of Maine. The only state with one name, with a single syllable name. The only state that borders only one other state, the only mainland state. It actually borders more Canadian provinces than it borders American states. The only state crossed by the National Railroad of another country, the Canadian National Railroad. The only state that has, by law, seats reserved in its legislature for Native Americans. Not in American law, it was by colonial treaty between the Indian nations and the British monarchy. It also, and I think this really explains a lot of Maine, it's the only state that more or less sat out the Industrial Revolution. It has a few mill towns, but basically most of Maine peaked before the Industrial Revolution. Its economy was built on fishing, wood, and ice. Wood for building and for warmth, ice for refrigeration. The Industrial Revolution really got rid of wood as a form of construction. People moved much more to steel and brick. And it also got rid of the need for wood for heating as people moved much more to coal and oil. The Industrial Revolution basically wipes out Bangor, Maine. Bangor, Maine in 1820 was the world's largest port, lumber port. It basically is the same town it was then. The title captures this difference. Everyone knows but you. Ryan Tapia, the FBI agent, figures out as he goes along everybody in Maine knows more about what's going on here than I do. And that's what draws the plot. It began with the thought, what happens if you write a story, a novel, in which everybody knows what's happening except the lead investigator? And hence the title of the book. And hence also the way the Mainers treat him. You must have screwed up pretty bad to get posted here. You know, another federal official at one point refers to him as J. Edgar. They don't care. This guy's from away, he doesn't really matter. And by the way, from away doesn't mean you're just somebody who's from somewhere else. It means you are from another culture, and you can be born in Maine and still not be considered a Mainer. As a neighbor of mine, one of the selectmen, told me once, just because the cat had the kittens in the oven doesn't make them biscuits. Maine also, by the way, seceded, not from Great Britain, but from another state, Massachusetts. And a lot of those towns that have names like Freedom, Unity, and Liberty, that commemorates their farewell to Massachusetts. And there's a term, very rude, they use for people from Massachusetts that I won't repeat, partly because we have some distinguished residents here. But they still, what they say to people from Massachusetts is leave your wallet and go home. It is a place also, you really notice physical labor is really honored and respected, and it takes a central place. And because you're on an island, because there's going to be only one roofer on the island, the roofer tells you this is what it's going to cost you. And you never go, hey, I think I have a job for you. The proper way to approach him is to say, I need you to help me out. And he said, I'll come by when I can. And then one day you walk out in your yard and there's a guy standing there, and he writes on a paper bag, okay, this is what it's going to cost you. And you say, thank you. And if you say no, thank you, and you try to bargain it down, as someone I know, he said, sorry, I'm too busy. And when the guy called some roofers in Bangor to see, he said, we're not coming down there. We get our truck's tires flattened. You go back to that roofer and you apologize. And you tell him you'll pay what he wants. The guy said no. I can't remember, I think the poor guy this happened to ended up moving to teach at Oxford. So, the antagonist of the book, Caleb Goodwin, is a lobsterman. His name, by the way, and almost all the names of the locals in the book, I took from the rolls of Revolutionary War soldiers who were on the pension rolls, partly because that's the names people have in Maine. The people around me, surprisingly frequently, live on pieces of land named for their family. You know, Stinson Peninsula, you go find Mike Stinson, he lives on Stinson's Peninsula, as his family has since the Revolution, when the United States, wanting to protect Maine from the British and Canada, gave free land to Revolutionary War veterans to sort of militarize the front. And a lot of people date their presence on the island to back then. I didn't call it Deer Isle, I called it Liberty Island, partly because I didn't want to think, well, it has to look like Deer Isle, and people can argue with me about whether it looks like Deer Isle. I just wanted to call it Liberty, a separate place where my imagination could roam. It's also a tip of the hat to one of my favorite books about Maine, called Liberty Men and Great Profiteers by the historian Alan Taylor, who has gone on to win, this was his first book, I think it grew out of his dissertation. He's gone on to win 2 Pulitzers for American history. He teaches at UVA, but his first book is just a wonderful book about Maine and also about why everybody in Maine hates Boston. For the same reason, I invented an Indian tribe, the Malpense, borrowing elements of a lot of Indian tribes, and they do call themselves, in their formal seals, Indians. So I stuck with that for them. The final thing that influenced me a lot was the realization that I loved so many books about Maine, so many novels about Maine. One of my favorite writers is Elizabeth Strout, lives in Brunswick. She's best known for Olive Kitteridge. And as I told my friend Tim Noah once, the funny thing about Olive Kitteridge is that, you know, people in Maine think Olive Kitteridge is sane and her optimist husband is insane. The rest of the country thinks Olive Kitteridge, this incredible, cynical, sour pessimist, is insane, and that her husband is sane. But my favorite book by Elizabeth Strout is actually Abide With Me, one of her earlier novels. And what I loved about it, reading it in Maine when we lived there year-round in the winter, the 5-month-long winter when the sun sets at 3:30, is that the winter light is a character in the novel. And because she's such a beautiful writer, it works. Richard Russo is another Maine writer who really captures pieces of it. And for reasons I still don't understand, Maine is like ground zero. In fact, actually, my part of Maine, the mid-coast around Blue Hill, is ground zero for great children's books. E.B. White lived just down the road in Brooklyn, Maine, spelled Brooklin. Charlotte's Web is set at the Blue Hill Fair, just up the road from us. Robert McCloskey, One Morning in Maine, Blueberries for Sal. The island that they lived on is just at the end of our harbor, Scott's Island. And actually, you still see, remind me, Sal, I see. Yeah, Sal has the same haircut that she did in the book, but she's now 75 or something. And Margaret Wise Brown, Scuppers the Sailor Dog, and Goodnight Moon also lived out on the summer on Penobscot Bay. The cover of the book shows Acadia National Park. We were actually there at this spot the other day. It's so dangerous, the little trail down there, that the national park people took down the signs for it. So it's one of those main things. You have to know where the trail is that leads to it. It's a place called Raven's Nest. The trail ends at a cliff that's about 150 feet. And I know from being there in the wintertime, you got to be really careful because when there's ice, you slide right down toward the cliff. And I think I'm going to end it there because we're running out of my time. Now I'd like to get to your questions. You're supposed to come up to this microphone and pose the questions. Any other rules I'm supposed to lay out? I think, there is a camera somewhere, so these will be recorded. So fire away. If not, I'm going to call on people, Tim.
Just to get you started, so what was it like for you? How many years ago did you move up to Maine?
Well, we bought the house up there. We live in an old captain's house overlooking the Northwest Harbor. We bought the house in, I think, 2008.
So what was it like for you initially, as coming from outside, going up there and making it your home at least some of the year, and then becoming accepted, or don't you feel like you're completely accepted yet?
I actually have a character in the novel. I don't know if you got to this part. Explain this one day. They have a caste system, and the top of the Brahmin caste is the lobstermen, what they call the highliners, the best lobstermen, and then below that are the dubs, the inferior lobstermen, still Brahmins, but not as respected. Then below that, you have other islanders. And anybody not from the island is always going to be an outsider. The famous essay written about George Washington is the kid on Deer Isle told to write about George Washington, writes, George Washington was our first president. He was born off island. That really does characterize people. The third caste is other Mainers. The fourth caste is year-round from awayers. And then just below them are the summer people. And then the fifth caste, the untouchables, are tourist, day visitors. And that's the people you just say, leave your wallet and go, get out. You'll never be accepted as a Mainer or as an islander. A friend of mine there is actually born in Norway, but his family moved to work in the stone quarries at the end of World War II. And he said to me, Sven said to me one day, he said, I will never be an islander. My kids, maybe, my grandkids, good chance. Mm-hmm. So it's a multi-generational thing. I mean, the town manager said to me one day, My family has been here for 250 years. When some guy buys a piece of land and tells people you can't go clamming down here anymore, we've been clamming there for 250 years. And I thought, well, the Indians have been clamming there for 10,000 years. But there is a sense of these people who just are buying land and living here, they're just kind of, these outsiders, they're just kind of renting it. And, one of the neighbors said to me one day about our house, "You guys are taking good care of that house." No, we actually lived there. No. But it was sort of, you've got one of the island assets, but it's not really yours. We actually had a thing when we lived there year round. We called it trespassing season, which is basically October to May. And I would just walk the dog all over the island on people's property just to explore it. A woman I know carried it. She and her friend went nude running through rich people's properties on the coast until they found out that there were cameras being installed. So it's very different, and there's real pride. And I mean, one guy said to me one day, we're sitting around talking, and he said, sometimes we get rid of new people here. He said, we push the birds out of the nest. He said, it can be real rough. One of the themes in the back of this is one of the first things I heard when we moved to Maine was that a guy had come to the island and had been selling drugs. And they ran him off the island. If you don't leave, you're going to get killed. But the flip side of that was we have our own drug dealers, people we know. People have been in the family for generations. Any other questions?
I'll do a quick follow-up on the gentleman's.
Okay.
I'm David Ricks. You may not remember, but I'm your older brother. I taught you everything you know. And you were born in 1955 in Essex, Massachusetts. I was already 5 years old by then. I know Essex, Massachusetts. It's a little lobster town, too. Actually, it's more of a clam town than a lobster town. But a lot of the stuff you're saying, it was true then. I don't know if it's as true now. I'm sure some of it is. I do know that our mom had a best friend there. Well, our mom had grown up in Essex, Massachusetts, even though they were truly the outsiders. Grandpa and Grandma had come from Cambridge, where he was a lawyer and all that kind of stuff. But she had chopped wood in Essex, Massachusetts, and they respected that part of it. She could go back. I only got there when I was 5 years old. We had lived elsewhere while folks were in school. And she had this best friend who was a few years older than she was. So Mom was in her 30s, and her friend was probably early 40s. She had married a guy from Essex at age 16, 17, typical about those days. And she was still known as the girl from Lynn.
Yeah. And will be her entire life.
Yeah.
There's an oddity there that kind of has puzzled me, is everything is known by who used to own it. So I've joked with people, because after we leave and sell our house, it'll be known as the Ricks' house. But this even extends to officially the road down the street from us is Quaco Road, but everybody calls it the Dump Road. And it's sort of like there's an official name and then a real name. The local Eggemogan Country Store is known as the Turtle Store because that's what it was known as until 1960. And people still say, I'm going over to the Turtle Store. It's almost like a code, an exclusionary code, like jargon can be in a profession, a way of knowing who is a real insider and who is just a wannabe and who's not touchable.
I have a question. What research did you do research for this book, and what was it, and did anything surprise you?
I did a lot of research for the book, and it surprised me that almost everything I'd done for the last 10 years had been a form of research. I was really into sailing for a long time. I was really into sea kayaking. Sea kayaking is a great way to learn a coastline. I was going up and into little coves and stuff. Sailing is such a good way of learning waters themselves. My boat specifically was a little sailboat, 20-foot long thing called a Cape Dory Typhoon with a huge 1-ton keel on it, specifically for deep water. Unlike the Chesapeake, you couldn't sail this boat in the Chesapeake. It's made for big winds, deep waters, and it won't be knocked over by a gust. And if you really did, I mean, I have taken the boat over pretty far. The keel is so heavy, it'll just go boom, back up. It's a slow boat, but, who cares? To me, actually, I realized one day when I was out sailing, Penobscot Bay on a sunny August afternoon with a 12-mile-an-hour wind out of the southwest was, to me, the exact opposite of war in Iraq. And it was just like therapy, being on that boat, sailing all day. Especially if you're out sailing alone. If a storm comes up, you just, anchor in a little harbor somewhere, and I had books and stuff, I had food I kept below. But I'd be sailing along, and like a porpoise would surface next to me. And then you'd sail around a little rock that had seals on it. It's just an enormously pleasant thing. But all of that became part of the book. I loved Maine history. And I went back to a lot of the books I'd read about Maine history. There's a terrific book called The Lobster Gangs of Maine, which, among other things, is a brilliant destruction of the theory of, what's it called, the abuse of the commons. David, what's the term for that? The tragedy of the commons. It's about how, in Maine, regulation of the lobster industry preserved the lobstering as it was destroyed in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York. Because Maine was on the first place to regulate the lobster industry, to say you cannot take big lobsters. And if you go into Morton's, they'll still sell you a 4-pound lobster. That's illegal in Maine. That's a lobster that's been found in Canada or somewhere else. In Maine, you can't take big lobsters because that's the breed stock. You only take lobsters under 2.5 pounds, basically, and over 1.5 pounds. I mean, so I had Mary Kay once with my wife out with me, and I had this really big lobster. And I looked at it and I just tossed it back. And she's like, no, stop. It was a 3.5 pounder, but you can't, it's illegal. You don't want to have that. If you're stopped by the Marine Patrol, that's an offense. And you see people, Maine has such great crimes. Tampering with traps is a fairly common, which means pulling other people's lobsters out of their traps. Another one is elving without a license, which does not involve elves. It involves catching what they call elvers, which are miniature fish that are a delicacy in China. They sell for $2,000 a pound, which will be several hundred fish. But elving without a license. So, and also another crime is stealing other people's maple syrup. So imagine, in Maine prison, what are you in for? Well, I stole maple syrup.
Hey, Tom. So I'm curious about the creative process, particularly writing a mystery. Did you know in the beginning who done it? Or did you develop a story and maybe change halfway through, including ultimately who the murderer was or whatever? I haven't read the book yet. How did you work?
It's been
through
out
that?
for 8 hours, Peg.
I know. Sorry.
It's a good question. It was, I knew exactly who it was the whole time. And I thought I'd been heavy-handed. And then my daughter Molly read the first draft and said, I had no idea. You got to give the reader some hints. So I went through and dropped what I thought were very heavy-handed hints throughout. And then Brad Graham tells me he's 2/3 of the way through and still hasn't figured it out. So I don't know. But what I wanted was a situation which everybody pretty much knew except the investigator. And I also wanted the flip side of that to be, at the end, he solves the crime not by finding the murder weapon, but finding someone has replaced the murder weapon, and that tells him who did it.
Uh-huh.
And this actually goes to one of the things I like least about Maine. Whenever you leave a tool on a boat, you come back the next day and it's spotted with brown from rust. Things just rust overnight, especially Chinese metal. I mean, one thing you learn with a sailboat is don't buy anything made with metal in China. It's just really inferior and it rusts really quickly. So this investigator goes on the boat and finds something that's unspotted, which means it's brand new.
So I have another question, just quickly.
Okay.
So I think you're the one who told me that E.B. White put, like, the name Templeton was a neighbor he didn't like. Did you put people you didn't like in the book? And
This is pure fiction.
Because I wanted to tell I was talking to my daughter about this, and she volunteered me to be one of the murderers in her book, but she didn't want me to be the victim because she thought that might be tempting the fates.
It is true that if you actually go to E.B. White's grave over in Brooklyn, Maine, which is basically ground zero for New Yorker writers. I mean, you just have to push them aside as you go into the cafe. In a great local library, I was telling Brad earlier, the Brooklyn Friends Library, it's called, in Brooklyn, Maine. The illustrations, the paintings on the wall are all the originals from Stuart Little. Because E.B. White's wife, Kathleen, donated all the children's books, Catherine, donated all the books that began that library. But yes, Templeton, if you go to E.B. White's grave across from the library and look 2 gravestones over, there's a man named Templeton. If you recall Charlotte's Web, Templeton's the rat.
Tom, hi. You and I work together at the Wall Street Journal, and I wanted to ask if I could have you put your Wall Street Journal cap on and tell us about the economics of lobstering, which I find fascinating. And as I recall from our discussions, that drugs do enter into the economic aspect of lobstering as well.
Lobstering is hard work, but it's also quite beautiful. Any lobsterman, and they use the term for women too. There's a lot of female, but they call themselves lobstermen. And actually, nobody calls themselves lobstermen. They call themselves fishermen, and I don't know why. When you're going then nobody says I'm going lobstering. They say I'm going fishing. The economics are basically, there are 3 elements: the cost of fuel, the cost of your boat, and the cost of bait. Your labor is basically free. It's your own. Whatever local kid you pull in to be the stern man on your boat. It's entirely dependent on basically the price of those things and also then what you're able to sell the lobster for. The great rescue of Maine's economy, people don't seem to know this, is the majority of Maine lobster is now consumed in China. There are direct cargo flights, I believe it's now twice a week, of 747s from Bangor, Maine to China, and all they carry is lobsters. They don't come back directly because there's nothing that, I think, Maine, except for Walmart stuff that comes back from Beijing or Shanghai. Drugs are really common, but there's really an attitude of don't bother me, we'll police ourselves, we'll take care of it. So, for example, there's only one road onto Deer Isle or Liberty Island. Often, when the state police come onto the island, people will call each other, "Statey's on the island." And suddenly you see people throw the beer cans out their car windows. Because, when you drive in Maine, how far is it from here to Castine? Oh, about 3 beers. And people really live a different life. The attitude is, this is the way we live here. Our homes are our castles. A pretty primitive attitude toward domestic violence. Basically, it's my business. She got out of line, so I had to knock her around. What would you do? And that's what they say to the police. I remember a sheriff I was talking to once said a real problem on these islands with their distinct sort of insular culture is we can have somebody dead to rights. If we bring them to trial, they'll never convict. And so frequently when we have people committing felonies, we charge them with misdemeanors because then we don't have to do a jury trial. They know the juries are just going to let them off. Old Bill, he's a good old guy. He fixed my boat once. What's a kilo or 2 of heroin between friends? The biggest single employer in the town, as you heard, is the boatyard. The boatyard is most famous because its owners were busted in the 1970s for every year when the yachts were brought back up from Florida, they loaded them up with tons of bales of marijuana, and they were selling them. It being Maine, nobody wanted to shut down the biggest employer in town, and so the Maine's congressional delegation eventually got the boatyard pardoned. That's how you maintain your economy. There's another, the contrary story to that is when somebody brought up, out from a ways, brought up a trawler full of marijuana. Everybody in these trucks were driving around asking for directions. Everybody on the island was saying, I don't know who these guys are, asking for Cat Cove. And they all called the police. Come bust these outsiders. And they all got hauled away. A lobsterman I know has the Cat Cove trawler ran away and the Coast Guard catch him, but they literally cut their anchor line. And a lobsterman I know went out and pulled up the anchor, and that's what the anchor he uses on his boat now. Never let an opportunity go to waste. Well, that takes care of our questions, I think. Now comes the fun time when I can sign books for you, unless there's anything else.
No, let's give Tom a round of applause.
Thank you.